Before we get into how to make sauerkraut and kimchi, I want to address a larger question. What is fermentation anyway, and why should we care about it? Broadly speaking, fermentation is the transformative action of microorganisms. Typically, we use this word to describe foods and beverages that we intend to put in our mouths. But obviously, the transformative action of microorganisms is bigger than that. The transformative action of microorganisms is usually the reason why we reject food. It's why we throw food into the compost or into the garbage or decide...
I grew up in New York City, in Manhattan, on the 14th floor of an apartment building on the Upper West Side. My dad had grown up in the Hudson Valley, so we spent a lot of time up at his family's land. My father always had a garden up in the Hudson Valley, so I always was exposed to fresh food out of the garden and always had a clear understanding of where vegetables come from, which I suppose not all city kids grow up with a clear understanding of. My path to fermentation was a very roundabout, circuitous path, and I would say that it began with my childhood taste for sour pickles and the sour flavors of fermented vegetables in particular. But I didn't grow up with a grandparent who had an annual fermentation practice or anything like that. I spent a couple of years in my 20s following a macrobiotic diet, and macrobiotics places quite a bit of emphasis on the digestive stimulation of live culture pickles. So that's when I began to be aware that there was a health benefit to these foods that I always had been drawn to. But even then, I wasn't making them myself, and it wasn't until I moved to Tennessee and started being involved in having a garden and was faced with the classic dilemma that all gardeners are faced with. All the radishes are ready at the same time, and all the cabbages are ready at the same time. I always had been a culinary explorer and enjoyed figuring out how to make things from scratch. So, once I had a big stack of cabbages and was trying to figure out things to do with them, I remembered how much I loved sauerkraut, and I explored in cookbooks and figured out how to make sauerkraut. So that, that began my exploration of fermentation. But really what put me on the path that I've been on of demystifying fermentation for people was when I was invited by some friends of mine to teach a sauerkraut making workshop at their family homestead. That was when I learned that in our culture there is a nearly universal fear of aging food outside of refrigeration, and that almost everybody is terrified that they might accidentally make somebody sick. They might accidentally kill someone. So that's when I realized that there was a hunger for this information and a lot of fear and a need for demystification. I was living in New York, and it was a time when I was looking to make a big change in my life, and I couldn't quite picture what that change was. And I just happened to be visiting a friend in New Orleans for Mardi Gras. And at a party a couple days before Mardi Gras, I met a couple of people who live at this community in Tennessee, and they regaled me with stories of life on their commune in Tennessee, and it seemed very intriguing. And I went down and visited a couple of times, and within a year I had moved down there and decided that moving from the city to the country was the big change I was looking for. Sauerkraut was definitely my gateway drug into fermentation, and once I learned how to make sauerkraut and started thinking about what fermentation was and the idea of the transformative action of microorganisms, I just started experimenting with all sorts of realms of fermentation. I already had done some baking, and I started learning about baking with sourdough. Like many people in our region of the country, I started making what are called country wines, basically sugar wines flavored with all sorts of flowers and fruits and vegetables and anything edible really. We have goats, so I started dabbling in cheese making and made yogurt and started learning about kefir. And then I met somebody who made miso, and I learned how to make miso. And so, one thing led to another, and it just snowballed, and I kind of became the fermentation guy. Broadly speaking, fermentation is the transformative action of microorganisms, and there are different types of organisms involved in different ferments. The broad categories would be bacteria and fungi. And among the fungi, you find yeasts, which are the most famous agents of fermentation, as well as various molds that are used in different ferments. So fermentation really covers, quite a broad realm of activity. But what they all have in common is that it's the transformative action of microorganisms. Fermentation has really been central to many different culinary traditions. I would go so far as to argue that people could not have made the transition from hunter-gatherer lifestyles where on a daily basis people were concerned with the food that they would eat in that day to agricultural lifestyles where they put a lot of energy into crops that would be ready at particular moments of the year. If they did not have some insight into fermentation techniques and techniques for preserving the harvest. So, I would say that agriculture would not be possible without some understanding of fermentation. Now, of course, human beings did not invent fermentation. Fermentation is a natural phenomenon. Fermenting bacteria, absolutely, predate not only human beings, but all animals and all plants. So fermentation has always been part of the context for life, and there are many examples of animals other than humans, enjoying the products of fermentation, stumbling upon fermenting fruits and such, and experiencing the fleeting pleasures of inebriation. But what's arguably unique to humans is that we learned how to harness that power and make it happen ourselves. We even use the same word, culture, to describe these little communities of bacteria that we transfer from one batch of yogurt into the next. And we use the same word to describe, not only our cultivation techniques, but, our language, literature, music, belief systems, scientific knowledge, and the totality of all things that people seek to pass on from generation to generation. In a number of ways, fermentation is very intrinsic to human cultures, and that, the story of human cultural evolution is very entwined with the history of various ferments. And the question of the origins of ferments is shrouded in mystery. They all are prehistoric. The earliest written texts in many different written traditions refer to existing ferments. These were, important parts of the cultures that, generated the texts and generated the earliest written records. My interest is helping people to reclaim fermentation as part of a larger project of reclaiming the food that we eat. Fermentation, like all aspects of food production, has always been part of the fabric of human communities. And it's only in the last couple of generations, as food production in general has disappeared into the realm of specialists and disappeared behind factory doors, that fermentation has largely disappeared from people's lives. And this is the reason why it's shrouded in so much mystery for people, because they don't see anybody doing it. And we live in this age of refrigeration where there is tremendous suspicion and fear of any food that has sat outside of refrigeration. People who work in any kind of food service industry have to go through a training where they are told that it's dangerous for people to eat food that has sat outside of refrigeration for more than 4 hours. Well, that might be a reasonable guideline for people working in the food service industry to follow. But I would say, as a truth, it is a lie, because, If that were true, none of us would be sitting here. Our species would have perished thousands of years ago. People, because they are clever, observed under what conditions the transformative action of microorganisms could make foods more stable and more safe and more digestible and more delicious versus those conditions under which the foods would deteriorate and be rendered inedible or inappropriate for consumption.
I got obsessed with botulism and have done a ton of research and reading, and there are no examples in the historical record anywhere, as far as I can find, of botulism developing in fermented vegetables. This is a really, really safe food. Now, I don't want to encourage you to sort of go home and think that on the basis of what I've told you here, you can ferment meat. Meat is a whole different story because, interior flesh is sterile. And so meat gets cultured with, whatever bacteria is on the knife, and there's much more randomness to it. And, botulism, before the 19th century, when canning was invented, the food that botulism was known for, where the word botulism comes from, is from the Latin word for sausage. And it was so ground meat.
Primarily, I'm interested in helping to demystify these ancient rituals for people, helping people to understand that that these are things that they can do in their own kitchen. And then, certainly, I think it's great to reinterpret these ancient arts and apply them in new ways or in new combinations or to new ingredients. It's not that I think we need to be wed to exactly the traditional way of doing everything, but I think that the basics of fermentation, the parameters for safety and success are very ancient, and they're not things that require a huge amount of technology, a degree in microbiology, the ability to identify specific microorganisms, the ability to have a completely sterile working environment, or any of those things. This is not rocket science. These are rituals that people have been doing for thousands of years. For the most part, I would say that fermentation is as much art as it is science. And although these processes have been successfely industrialized, and they're done, in factories by food scientists, under sterile conditions, et cetera, they do not require highly exacting conditions or proportions. And I think that, if you look at the highly varied traditions for, any of the foods that have diffused through wide geographic areas, take something like sauerkraut, it is interpreted in virtually infinite ways. There are lots of grandmas with secret recipes and secret spices that they put in, or their own sense of proportions. And if you look at communities where this is still alive or this has been practiced for a long time, you can just find infinite variation. The kimchi in Korea, there's not a single style. There are regional styles, there are seasonal styles, and there are family secrets. So all of these things have lots of room for individual creativity. People, introducing, special ingredients. People combining things in unique ways. People leaving out the salt altogether because they've been told that they need to avoid salt. There's lots of latitude for personal creativity, really, in all of the fermentation processes. Something that's interesting to me is that I think that fermentation is an interesting realm in which lots of different contemporary food movements are intersecting. So, for instance, if you are a locavore and you're seeking to, eat an exclusively local diet or a primarily local diet, and you live in a climate like here in Vermont, fermentation has to be part of the picture. It's how you have fresh vegetables to eat through the long winter. So, people who are interested in, reviving an emphasis on local foods are interested in fermentation. Lots of different nutritional movements come together in the realm of fermentation, because fermentation, augments the nutrients in food so well, makes food so much more digestible. There's a huge food recycling movement of, kids diving into dumpsters and trying to rescue discarded food resources. Well, if you're a dumpster diver, and you're finding, 50 pounds of turnips in the dumpster behind a supermarket, well, fermentation is the perfect thing to do with it. So I would say that fermentation is not, necessarily a food movement in and of itself, but rather an important, realm of food, in which lots of different food movements intersect. The actual dynamics of the microbial growth vary quite a bit depending on what the substrate is, the food that you're fermenting, and what the organism is. If we look at a food with a dense, complex nutrient, say protein, I think that one of the most vivid illustrations is the protein in soybeans. Soybeans have gotten a lot of attention because they are considered to be the vegetable food with the most concentrated protein. Well, unfortunately, our human digestive systems cannot extract that protein from the soybeans. So when we ferment the soybeans, and that is typically done with mold cultures, the molds basically break down the protein into amino acids that become much more accessible to our human digestive processes. So, each ferment is a little bit different. In terms of the fermentation of milk, you have bacteria digesting the lactose and transforming it into lactic acid, which many people find easier to digest. So there is this important aspect of pre-digestion in ferments. Now, as far as a comparison to canning, canning is really the diametrical opposite of fermentation. In fermentation, we are cultivating the growth of microorganisms, and we're trying to guide which populations of microorganisms are growing, and to some degree to control the rate of growth of the microorganisms. But in canning, we are trying to completely prevent the growth of microorganisms by sterilizing the food, and that certainly has useful applications. Most ferments you can't store in your cellar for years, waiting for the apocalypse, whereas canned foods you can. But that convenience, comes at a nutritional cost, because the sterilization is achieved by the application of high heat, and heat diminishes certain nutrients. So, if you compared the vitamin C in canned sauerkraut to the vitamin C in, fresh fermented live sauerkraut, you'd find that there's much higher level of vitamin C in the fresh live sauerkraut than in the canned product. Fermentation has many nutritional benefits. I mean, I've alluded a little bit to the benefit of pre-digestion. Fermentation actually augments nutrients by contributing additional B vitamins to foods, by contributing unique micronutrients. Fermentation can make foods more edible by detoxifying foods. But really, what I would consider to be the most profound nutritional benefit of fermented foods is the live cultures themselves. Not all fermented foods contain live cultures. Live culture foods would be a subset of fermented foods. For instance, breads typically do not have their live cultures intact because they've been in a hot oven baking. If you want to eat raw dough has live cultures, and even the foods that can have live cultures. Like sauerkraut, often the commercial versions are pasteurized so that they won't be perishable, and they'll have a long shelf life and be able to be stored without refrigeration. But the significance of the live cultures is that they are, really the same types of bacteria that we all have in our digestive system and that we all need in order to effectively digest our food, in order to assimilate nutrients. And they play a huge role in our immune function because they create a competitive situation which prevents potentially pathogenic bacteria from establishing themselves in our bodies. So if we are continually wiping out the bacteria in our intestines, then we are basically setting ourselves up to be microbial blank slates where the pathogens that we all inevitably encounter in the course of our lives have an easy time establishing themselves. Now, I would say that historically nobody really had to think very hard about replenishing the bacteria in their intestines, but we are living in extraordinary times, and the influences of antibiotic drugs, not only that people elect to take as individuals, often for very important reasons, but there's the overuse of antibiotics is simply resulting in an accumulation of antibiotic chemicals in the water table. So every time we drink water, we're ingesting low levels of antibiotics. The other thing we find in water from municipal tap systems is chlorine, which is put in there to kill bacteria. So there are all these factors in our contemporary lives, reflections of what I call the war on bacteria, which subject the bacteria in our digestive systems to more or less constant assault. And so for us living in the 21st century, more than for people ever before, it's become critical to consciously replenish the bacterial populations in our intestines. And one way people do this is with supplements called probiotics. But I think that the far better way to do it is with foods. And it just so happens that the live culture fermented foods are some of the most delicious, flavorful foods that people have ever figured out. Fermentation has been a way for farmers to add value to the products of agriculture. And really it's been, part of how farmers have been able to make farming an economically viable activity. So, if you can take your cabbage and turn it into sauerkraut, it becomes considerably more valuable. If you can take your milk and turn it into cheese, it becomes considerably more valuable. If you can take your apples and turn it into hard cider, it becomes considerably more valuable. So I would say that the revival of fermentation is really important for making farming into an economically viable activity for small scale farmers. So that's another way that fermentation is important economically in this local food revival. So I have two different books. One is Wild Fermentation, The Flavor, Nutrition, and Craft of Live Culture Foods, which focuses on fermentation and how to ferment lots of different foods yourself at home. And my second book is The Revolution Will Not Be Microwaved, Inside America's Underground Food Movements. And it was really a pretty direct progression from one to the other. After Wild Fermentation came out, I spent the better part of 2 years traveling around, teaching fermentation workshops, talking to people about fermentation. And the people who I met who were interested in fermentation largely were people who were grassroots food activists of one stripe or another, people who were engaged in what I found to be really interesting projects, whether they were as straightforward as reviving local markets for food, reestablishing farmers markets, people starting CSAs and trying to figure out how fermentation might extend the season of their CSA farms, and many other types of food activism, some of which I wasn't particularly aware of. People who are trying to revive the important art of seed saving. To reclaim our seed stock, people who are involved in food recycling, people who are clean water activists. So anyway, I felt very inspired by all this grassroots food activism that I encountered as I traveled around the country, and I felt inspired to write about it. So The Revolution Will Not Be Microwaved is really the story of grassroots food activist projects that I encountered as I traveled around talking about fermentation.
We think of milk as a highly perishable food. Well, it turns out that the idea of fresh milk is really a 20th century phenomenon. Throughout history, what people drank was soured milk. And so once the milk...
The context in which I see my work in teaching people about fermentation and reviving fermentation is a much larger project of people reclaiming the food that they eat. In a nutshell, I would say that applying the principles of mass production to our food has been a huge failure. It is resulting in environmental destruction. It's resulting in a diminishment of our health. It is resulting in the destruction of any notion of economic security. And I think that it is critically important that people reclaim their food. Now, if you look at the big picture, in certain regards, things are very bleak. We see unprecedented concentration at every level of food production, distribution, etc. I mean, starting with the seed stock and the way that seed ownership has become concentrated, continuing through control of the major livestock markets, continuing through food retailing, where we have, ever larger chain retailers who are dictating the terms to the farmers who are supplying them with food and are determining what choices consumers have. So in one regard, things are very bleak. What I find hopeful is that there is a rapidly growing, dramatic movement of people, demanding organic food, demanding locally produced food, supporting local farmers, more and more people getting involved in local food production, either through the model of community-supported agriculture, or just through small farming ventures. And so, while so far that that force for change, is not, toppling the big actors in the mass-produced food system. I think that we really have to focus on how we can create change within our realms. And, one thing I can say for certain is that, sustainability is not a spectator sport. Sustainability is not something you can buy as a consumer. If we want to create sustainability, sustainability means participation, and people have to become participants in creating better food choices for themselves and for other people in their communities. And so, I think we have to break out of this infantilizing role of consumer, and more of us have to take on creating food for ourselves and for other people. And I'm not preaching self-sufficiency. I'm preaching participation. And I think that there are lots of different ways that people can become participants in creating better food choices in their communities. And I think that thinking about changing the world is too big. It boggles the mind, and it just makes us feel disempowered. We have to think about what we can do in the small realm in which we can have an impact. And we have to do it, and then that gives some structure to hope and positive action in our lives, and really each of us can make a difference, and food is an important realm in which we're all involved with several times every day, through being involved in food production, through helping to create better choices in our communities, we can make a difference and, start creating the better world that we want to be part of.